Making moonshine is a basic process involving only a few steps. The following short information is provided by Colonel Wilson. It is for informational purposes only, and all rights are explicitly reserved. Yeast is the creature that eats sugar and excretes alcohol. So the process of distilling is to feed yeast some form of sugar. After a few weeks it has consumed the sugar, replacing it with ethanol alcohol such as in a wine or ale. Then the wine or ale is poured into the still to remove the alcohol from the solution. If you distill a wine, for instance, then you have brandy. If you distill an ale, then you have whiskey. If you have a recipe made from sugar cane squeezings, then your distilled product would be rum. Most first-time distillers and brewers make the mistake of killing the yeast by adding it while the temperature is too hot or too cold, or simply letting the fermenter get too hot or cold during the process. Yeast is a living creature not unlike goldfish. If you let your aquarium get too hot or cold, it will kill your goldfish. If you overfeed or underfeed the goldfish, they may die or not do well. Yeast in the same way needs to be kept at temperatures usually between 68 and 90 degrees. However, about 78 to 80 degrees is usually the sweet spot. You need to read your package of yeast to determine how much to feed and its temperature range. There are hundreds of known strains of yeast having different parameters. So now let's go over a simple procedure for making a whiskey. As you now know, yeast does not eat the corn or oats or barley but the sugars that are in those things. So the first step is to extract the sugar from the corn. One way is to pour several pounds of corn into a bucket. Then heat water to boiling in the stock pot. Then carefully add the boiling water over the corn until it is well covered. Then stir the corn around and lay the lid on top of the bucket. Leave the bucket to sit for about 90 minutes. Then pour the liquid from the bucket into your fermenter, leaving behind the solids. You do not want the solids in your fermenter or still because it produces a bad aftertaste. You have now made a form of sugar. This form is a light, but thin corn syrup. While it is still hot, you can now melt in more sugar to help increase the amount of alcohol in your recipe. Now you finish adding cool water to help cool the recipe down to yeast pitching temperature. It may take several hours for it to cool to 80 degrees. One trick is to freeze some 2-liter pop bottles of water and float them in the mash to help cool it faster. But not to cool. This was the hard way to make your own corn syrup to feed the yeast. You can avoid all of this work by simply buying corn syrup at the grocery store. You simply add 1 quart of corn syrup per gallon and a half of water. This simple recipe does not make much, but it can be some of the very best, especially if you use light corn syrup. You can also buy corn sugar in 50-pound bags. Once you have determined that your recipe has properly cooled, then you add yeast. Amounts of yeast vary. Usually the rate is 1 to 4 ounces of yeast per 10 gallons of recipe. So 2 ounces is enough. And this will allow you to add more to your recipe if you accidentally kill your yeast. After adding the yeast, lay a cover over your fermenter bucket. But do not seal it. Pressure will build in the bucket and it will burst. So only lay a cover or lid on top. This keeps out other wild forms of yeast as well as bugs and rats. If bugs or rats get into your fermenter bucket, simply dip them out. It will not hurt anything and may add character to your recipe. Let the yeast work for 7 to 14 days. You can determine when it is ready by using a hydrometer. When the hydrometer stops dropping, then the yeast has stopped working. Now you are ready to distill. The best still to use is a copper still. Copper is the very best cooking material for multitudes of reasons. Copper is over 4 times more thermoconductive than stainless. Copper is also an antipathogen metal. Copper has a good reputation for removing sulfate toxins. And finally, copper provides the very best taste to any product. Side by side, copper provides a brisk taste. However, if you do not have a copper still, stainless will work fine. First, set your copper still on your heat source such as a propane burner. Next, carefully pick up your fermenter buckets one at a time and pour them slowly in at the still, being careful not to pour in the sediments. The sediments will cause a bad flavor. Then set the head on the still, and then pour cool water into your condenser. If you are using a water jacket condenser, then start your water flowing. A trickle of water is a fast enough flow. Now turn your heat source up all the way. You want to get up to temperature fast. Depending on where your thermometer is placed on the still, the distilling temperature may be between 178 to 193 degrees Fahrenheit. However, whatever temperature your still starts to drip, it is the right temperature. Simply try to hold it within a few degrees of this temperature. After the still starts to drip and run, then cut your burner back to a small flame. It will not take much heat to hold your still at the right temperature. Now simply get your shot glass ready and call the paramedics. All distilling runs take about the same amount of time regardless of the size of still. Usually 4 to 8 hours, with about 5 or 6 hours being the average. When the still starts dripping ridiculously slow or stops, then you are done. Some folks try to separate out the heads, tails and middle runs. But it is not necessary. Throwing away the first quarter cup that runs from the still is all that is needed. This is only a safety measure. In case there is wood grain alcohol in the recipe, it will be in this first quarter cup. But it may also be perfectly good alcohol. Remember to stay safe. Never use wood for a fermenter bucket. Never use wood in your fermenter. This will cause wood grain alcohol to be produced. It is deadly. Never use an old car radiator for a condenser. The antifreeze embedded in the radiator will come out into your product. Remember that only poison causes hangovers. Many commercial brands of alcohol will give you a hangover from the poison it contains. Clean alcohol does not. Most homemade alcohol is clean and does not cause hangovers. However, you can get a dull headache from dehydration from clean alcohol. A glass of water is the remedy. After distillation, you can store your product in a charred keg. This will mellow the flavor. But most clean alcohol does not need to be aged. If you decide to store it in a keg, always do so uncut. That is, without adding water. When your product has been distilled, you may find it to be at too high of proof for drinking. Simply cut it with water, or fruit juices, or a combination of those things back to 80 or 100 proof. Never throw away a bad-tasting batch of moonshine. You can always redistill it with your next batch. To simply pour it out is alcohol abuse. If your moonshine appears cloudy or chalky, once you have cut it to 100 proof, or less, this is grain oils. Grain oils are not poisonous. Grain oils are used to fry potato chips and other great snacks. However, it can be unsightly, and sometimes cause a poor taste. A simple method for removal is to pour the product through a water filter pitcher. Many retail and hardware stores have them at inexpensive prices. Stay safe and be sure to visit coppermoonshinestills.com. Remember, coppermoonshinestills.com. The very finest in copper stills. God bless.